I'd now like to welcome to the stage another important woman, Auntie Diane Kerr, to undertake the welcome to country. Thank you for being here, Auntie.
Good morning, everyone. I'd like to pay my respects to my elders past and present, elders present here today, elders of different nations that are here today. I'd like to acknowledge the ministers, acknowledge people from across the waters, and Wominjeka, welcome to our country. Acknowledge community and wider community, and pay my respects to your ancestors, elders and families. And I'm very proud and honoured to be here. This is part of the traditional country of my grandmother and mother and ancestors. And my family lived along the Birrong Ma, the Yarra River, for thousands of years before they were moved to the mission in Healesville called Corrandirk, where my grandmother and my great-grandmother grew up. And because of the strength of women that I'm able to be here today to be able to welcome you on their behalf. And it's actually an honour to be in front of a lot of people that are mentors and important persons in their community. And I think, you know, we have a troubled world at the moment, and in our communities a lot of strife and a lot of lateral violence and family violence and drug and alcohol issues. And we have a lot to do and a lot to think about how to heal our communities. So I'm asking you here today to please think about talking to each other and sharing about who we are and where we come from, and sharing our different laws and customs. It's very important that we do this so that we can all live in harmony. And if we live in harmony, we can eradicate racism and stigma. You know, when I came in the doors, people behind me sort of rushed behind me and were protesting, and I felt very sad that there's protesters here today where we could have people here today celebrating the world together. So I do implore that you do talk to each other while you are here, because it's important that we do live in harmony, because it's our children and our up-and-coming future leaders that benefit from that and live in peace. So I'd like to offer you my hand in friendship, and I do that with cultural respect and dignity, as a symbol so that we can all walk together. May Bunjil, my Creator, surround you all and keep you safe on country. And on behalf of my elders, I say Wominjeka, Wurundjeri, Balak, Yemen, Gundibik, which means welcome to the home of my country. And I wish to welcome you all from the tops of the trees to the roots in the ground, because when you look after this country, it will look after you. Thank you.
We'll begin the conference with our first speaker, and I'm truly pleased to introduce one of the best-known Australian community leaders. He's a leader not only of our community, he's a leading voice on social justice, on leadership and on ethics. He's also a wonderful boss, a good friend to many in this room, and great counsel. I'd like to welcome to the stage the CEO of World Vision and also the chair of the C20 steering committee, the wonderful Tim Costello.
Well, thank you for that introduction. It's pretty much as I wrote it, really. We really want to warmly welcome you to the Australian C20 Summit. We've been looking forward to hosting you, and though the weather's cold at the moment, you get a choice of weather in Melbourne, all in one day. Just wait, it'll change soon. As we gather, the world economy is slightly brighter, but it remains fragile, with sustained growth not guaranteed. And as a C20, we are certainly committed to seeing growth. The G20's finest moment, I think we'll agree, was when there was a burning platform in the global financial crisis, and the lack of global mechanisms, because we've suddenly discovered no one of the 200 sovereign nations can ever actually address the great challenges of the globe, whether they be climate change or terror or drugs or trafficking or banks that are melting down. And the G20 acted decisively. Since then, there's been some drift, and it's the hope of the Australian presidency to really, I guess, restore some leadership, courage from leaders, decisiveness to land some things in this G20, given the profound paralysis of some other international bodies. We've seen the inability to cope with the humanitarian disaster and civil war in Syria spilling over into Iraq. The sense of profound paralysis is why we are placing such hopes in this G20. But I think we gather to say there still is a burning platform. That burning platform is the 850 million people who went to bed hungry last night. It's the 75 million young people who are unemployed, their potential and future being destroyed. It's the 80 million child labourers in the world who don't get an education. The burning platform of recognising that for every dollar of aid, some $3 often flows out because of tax havens and corruption and secrecy. And we carry the hopes as civil society, fragile hopes of those sorts of groups, women and children, those who are on the margins, who are unemployed, left over, left out, seemingly on the scrap heap. We carry their fragile hopes that this G20 will actually decide some things that includes them, that gives them a future. So it's our view that growth must not come at the expense of certain parts of the population, young, elderly, unemployed, poor, those who just were born in the wrong latitude, weren't thrown up on the stage of life called Australia, where you have certain guarantees, or some of the first world countries. We're here not just to find solutions. I think in 5 minutes this gathering could actually describe the world we want, and there's plenty of solutions on the table. I think we're here to say to leaders, take some courageous steps, find some consensus, think globally, resist the turning inwards. We know with the fear and the chauvinistic nationalism, populism running, we've seen it with Le Pen and You Pick and black shirts and sometimes Muslim terror, Hindu nationalism, Christian greed. It's thankful for me as a Christian that we've got a Pope actually talking about Western and Christian greed. Actually, we need you as leaders to know civil society is there saying, take some steps. We're with you. But in also trying to find some solutions, the Australian presidency of this preeminent economic forum has really focused and narrowed the agenda to try and land some things, which is why the terms of reference that we're operating in are narrower. That's not to say there won't be other positions in our position papers, but the communique we'll come up with by the end of these 2 days will be trying to focus, to land, to give the world some sense that there is an international mechanism that can act for people who are in pain. When we think about what unites us, I think it is for civil society the question of equity and fairness. I attended a birthday party years ago when my son, youngest, was invited, and the Australian, I guess it's true of other cultures, celebration is you whip out a cake, you have candles on it, you sing happy birthday, you whip off the candles and you cut up the cake into pieces. And an American mum was there. I'm not saying this is true of all Americans, but she just said to the Australian mum, what are you doing? She said, oh, this is our practice. Each child's getting a piece. They can eat it now. They can take it home later if they choose. The Australian mum and I were surprised to hear the American mum say, but is that fair? And we said, well, yes, every child's getting a piece, and it's the same size piece. It couldn't be fairer. What do you mean? She said, oh, I get that, but you haven't asked children if they want a piece and what size piece they want. You've just made the decision for them. Some may not want a piece at all. We were a little surprised at this. Well, there is a strand of justice in what she's saying. People need to be empowered to make choices, not just someone above making it for them. That is a strand of fairness. But when we think about the debate going on in this country post the budget, which is, are we sharing the pain equally? And Australians who believe in a fair go, there's no escaping that debate, I think is the unifying question for C20. What is the notion of fairness? What will be the financial architecture that really addresses these notions? So equity and fairness is on the table, not just for moral reasons, but because we know that the world's wealthiest 85 individuals own more wealth than the 3.5 billion of the rest of the world's population who are poor. We know that fairness for civil society, which thankfully in this process has a seat or at least a voice at the G20 table, needs to be raised. When we think about our areas, inclusive growth and employment, the fairness question is encapsulated in inclusive growth. The Economist, right of centre magazine, very, very powerfully said that growth, economic growth in more equal societies is much more efficient for lifting people out of poverty. Where economic activity happens in unequal societies, it doesn't lift people out of poverty. There's economic arguments for the fairness debate. The IMF said that in unequal societies, even when there's growth, it's not sustainable because of inequality. The World Bank said where there's not gender equality, ethnic equality, there's much weaker growth. Inequality is profoundly an economic blocker. With global unemployment at 200 million, with young people 3 to 4 times more likely to be without a job and their best chance in life being destroyed, and we know that that's devastating for economic growth. Economic activity comes from 3 sources: from capital, based largely on savings. Most governments are broke, as we know. It comes from labour, and certainly in first world countries, our labour isn't as cheap and we're not replicating ourselves with ageing communities. But it comes from productivity. That's using capital and labour more smartly. Young people and their education and their skills is absolutely profoundly important for productivity. It's devastating when we have that much youth unemployment. So, whether it's gender inequality or young people locked out, this equity question around inclusive growth and employment is fundamental. As we know, climate change is one of those issues that profoundly affects the world. I was at Copenhagen when it failed, and it was really the question, who owns the sky? And industrial nations saying, well, we've had our industrial growth, we've put carbon up there, we admit, but you can't take our growth and chances away from us. Developing countries saying, well, we own a portion of that sky, and you've got to move aside and make sacrifices for us to have our growth. And as we saw, in some respects, Copenhagen fragmented around that fairness question also. Well, the challenges of adaptation mitigation are huge. The challenges for the economy, if we don't address this, are huge. This is why, whether it's innovative technologies or financing, civil society is concerned about it. Open data is a key theme of this summit. Open data builds trust in community, trust in governments. The trust deficit of populations, constituents for their governments across the world is profound, worrying, serious. Never before have so many people felt distanced from politics, not cared about politics, felt a disengagement. It's as if they've unhinged from the political process. Sometimes it's just very mysterious questions. Why doesn't one vote seem to translate into one value? And of course, Piketty in his book on capital is saying because it's the wealthy who fund elections and write the policies, and that determines how policies are run even in democracies with one person, one vote. A conclusion to say political equality does depend to some extent on economic equality. You can't have it without that. Well, we are certainly pushing strongly for transparency and open data. Infrastructure, incredibly important for growth, for investment, but incredibly important to be done with participation from communities. So their displacement isn't arbitrary and unfair, and for environmental considerations. One of the most important contributions of civil society to the G20 has been around tax justice and transparency, another theme of this summit. We certainly have seen civil society, particularly in London, public demonstrations against Starbucks, Google, Apple, saying, we pay our tax. How come these multinationals aren't paying their tax? They're not sharing the burden. And though tax havens and secrecy has been on the agenda for a long time, initially in South Korea 2010, concerned about the developing world and what was flowing out because of corruption, not much was happening until civil society, particularly in Western nations where the power does still lie, were protesting. And then David Cameron said, absolutely, you're right, it's a shock. It's interesting David Cameron saying it because many tax havens in the world have postage stamps with the Queen's face on them. But there he was, and it's terrific. Beneficial registers to give transparency that the British are bringing in. That is incredibly important, so we can actually, as punters, say, if we're paying our tax, who else is avoiding it, minimising it, even where it's legal and opaque? We need transparency to look at that. So these are the tasks for us and the themes for us, and I'm very excited that you've made the effort at considerable cost and inconvenience to come to Melbourne to be part of this process. C20 is now a constituent collaborative partner in the G20 process. We should celebrate that, welcome that, say we will be interpreters for people who don't get the financial architecture of automatic tax information exchange and country-by-country reporting and technical terms. This is actually our interpretation for you to say it affects your lives. It's important to be engaged. It is a mechanism, if it shows leadership and consensus is found, that actually benefits the people whose fragile hopes at some level we hold in our hands. Thank you. It's now my great delight to introduce Julie Bishop. Julie's the Australian Minister for Foreign Affairs, and I've known Julie for some time. She's passionate, committed, has vision, and has already set her stamp in her portfolio. Australia now sits on the Security Council and is playing an extraordinarily important role in that Security Council. She was sworn in as Australia's Foreign Minister in September last year, following 4 years in the role of Shadow Minister for Foreign Affairs and Trade. She was elected to Parliament in 1998. She's based in Perth and travels a huge way. Anyone living in Western Australia to work in Canberra pays a high cost, so I take my hat off to you for that extraordinary commitment. She's previously served as Minister for Education, Science and Training, Minister assisting the Prime Minister for Women's Issues, and as Minister for Ageing. She holds a law degree. She's practiced commercial law before entering Parliament. She remains a patron and member of many business, cultural and sporting organisations in her West Australian electorate of Curtin. Thank you for being here. Please welcome her.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, delegates. Thank you, Tim Costello, for that very kind introduction, and thank you for the passion and enthusiasm that you show. Tim Costello is a positive force for good in our community here in Australia and globally. I'm delighted to be here in Melbourne this morning to open the C20 Summit. This is an exciting year for Australia as we host the G20, and I believe it's an exciting year for the G20. For our presidency is an opportunity to ensure the G20's economic reform agenda has global reach and benefits. It's notable that the G20 nations account for 85% of global GDP, 75% of global trade, and 2/3 of the global population. But its core objectives, lifting global growth, creating jobs and building resilience following the global financial crisis, are good for all nations. Economic growth is the most powerful weapon against poverty. That's why Australia's new aid policy that I released in Canberra at the National Press Club last Wednesday aligns the goal of poverty reduction with regional economic growth. This goal, of course, is in Australia's national interest, but it is unambiguously focusing on alleviating regional poverty and promoting prosperity. Aid can no longer be seen in isolation from economic drivers. Aid now accounts for only a small fraction of resources for development. In 2013, global overseas development assistance was about $135 billion, but remittances were more than $400 billion, private capital flows almost $900 billion, and tax revenues in developing countries were $7.7 trillion. So these facts challenge the traditional development approach and must be seen as a catalyst for leveraging other sources of finance and opening up the potential of the private sector. For it's the private sector that creates jobs and drives economic growth. A large part of our development effort needs to be about providing an environment in which the private sector can thrive. Australia's aid program will now respond to this reality, and aid will promote economic growth and tackle poverty through a strong emphasis on initiatives including aid for trade. Aid for trade investments, for example, will be increased to 20% of our aid budget by 2020. We recognise that human development and economic growth are two sides of the same coin. The aid program will continue to invest in education, in health, reducing disaster risks, responding to humanitarian crises, better governance and accountability, as well as empowering women and girls. A new performance framework is part of our new aid policy, and I will ensure that funding is informed by progress against a rigorous set of targets and performance benchmarks. This will guarantee that aid is being delivered through the most effective partners, and we will consult with our NGO partners on implementing our aid policy. And in what I consider a groundbreaking approach, we are establishing a development innovation hub within the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade to attract into that hub the best and most creative thinkers in the area of development, but more broadly, that we're able to find in Australia, from overseas. And these creative people will be tasked with coming up with innovative and creative and original ideas and ways of doing things so that we can trial and test and scale up if they prove to be a better way of solving seemingly intractable aid challenges. So the search is now on for the best and brightest and most creative thinkers that we can find. Our objectives in our new aid policy align with Australia's priorities for the G20, especially in focusing on economic growth. We're now into the second half of our 12-month presidency, and we're committed to making the Leaders' Summit in Brisbane in November a success. Part of that success will be built on engagement with our partners outside government, civil society, business, labour, youth and think tanks. Each brings a unique and valuable perspective to global economic issues, and I commend the C20 summit in bringing together a diverse and engaged group of civil society representatives from around the world. Over the next 2 days, you'll discuss the 4 themes of the C20 summit: inclusive growth and employment, infrastructure, climate and sustainability, and governance. Let me take this opportunity to outline the Australian Government's perspective in relation to the 4 themes. First, on inclusive growth and employment. The G20 is committed to taking practical steps to lift growth and create jobs. Last February, G20 countries committed to taking new measures, individually and collectively, that will lift GDP across the G20 by more than 2% over the next 5 years. And to do this, G20 countries will need to go beyond previous commitments and address challenges and economic constraints in their economies. Australia is doing its part to help the G20 meet this ambition. We're reducing red tape, we're abolishing unnecessary taxes, we're increasing competition, we're boosting workforce participation, and we're supporting significant investment in productivity-enhancing infrastructure, all of which will help improve productivity that Tim Costello spoke about. It will lift growth and create jobs. Now, if the G20 is successful in meeting this ambition, we could deliver more than $2 trillion in extra global GDP, and that would create millions of jobs globally. Global trade helps drive economic growth. China is the case study. China's inclusion in the global trading system has underpinned its spectacular economic rise, which has seen hundreds of millions of people lifted out of poverty. That's why we want G20 countries to implement as soon as possible the WTO Trade Facilitation Agreement that was concluded in Bali in December last year. And this agreement has the potential to create US $1 trillion in economic activity. It's estimated up to 21 million new jobs, 18 million of which will be in developing countries. G20 employment ministers will meet in September to discuss ways to create better jobs and boost employment. Encouraging female participation in the workforce must be a key element of these discussions, and it's a particular policy passion of mine. In the Asia-Pacific region alone, it's estimated that up to US $47 billion is lost per annum because of women's limited access to employment opportunities. And across the world, the strength and capacity of 865 million women is seriously underutilised in contributing to economic growth. So the only way to address this issue is through changes in policy and changes in attitude. In terms of policy, things like accessible childcare, women-friendly workplaces, tax concessions for businesses that help women return to the workforce, support for part-time employment, enhanced parental leave, and legislation and changes in attitude on sexual harassment, on domestic violence. Change has to occur beyond domestic employment policies. For example, the G20 Development Agenda is promoting the expansion of financial services to a broader range of people, specifically focusing on women. These services that many take for granted allow people to save, set up businesses, secure their incomes and manage risks through good and bad times, and women need equal access to these services. We know that gender equality and women's economic engagement helps drive growth and development. Investing in women is not just the right thing to do, it's the smart thing to do. Secondly, infrastructure. The G20 is focused on creating the climate to attract private sector investment. The OECD has estimated the global infrastructure gap to be about $70 trillion by 2030. And if steps aren't taken, this gap will continue to grow. There's a lot of private sector money out there, but we need to get the settings right. And this is something that governments can do quite usefully. Individual G20 countries are focused on removing impediments to private sector investment. This may mean less regulation, more predictable policies, but the G20 is also working with international organisations to improve investment climates and leverage private sector involvement. For example, we would like multilateral development banks to use their expertise to help countries create a pipeline of bankable projects. So identifying bankable projects is an area where Australia's aid program is already helping. For example, Australia is currently contributing about $30 million to the Philippines Public-Private Partnership Centre to help prepare, tender and award 26 public-private partnership infrastructure projects, and the value is about $7 billion. And these projects are funding highways and expressways, more than 13,000 extra classrooms in schools, an orthopaedic hospital, an updated train and ticketing system, and a new airport passenger terminal. And so that's what we want to see, bankable projects, a pipeline of them, and then we can get public-private partnerships and other financing models to focus on them. On climate change, international meetings like the G20 cannot and should not try to cover all subjects and thus illuminate none, trying to be all things for all people. We must keep a strong and focused economic agenda for the G20, otherwise it will lose its focus. And we must prioritise issues where there's a consensus within the G20 on taking action. All G20 members agree that the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change is the right forum with the right mandate for international climate change negotiations. In fact, G20 leaders have underlined their support for the UN negotiation process and have done that since 2009. But of course, the G20 continues to take practical action to address climate change. For example, by promoting energy efficiency and the phasing out of inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. Energy efficiency is one of the most cost-effective ways to reduce emissions and meet rising demand while supporting growth and development. Inefficient fossil fuel subsidies continue to distort energy markets and encourage wasteful consumption. The global cost of fossil fuel subsidies expanded to about $545 billion in 2012, despite efforts at reform. Eliminating subsidies such as these would reduce global greenhouse gas emissions by 10% or more by 2050. So I think there should be more of a focus at the G20 on this aspect. On the fourth theme of governance, the G20 is focused on continuing reforms of the financial sector, supporting stronger tax systems and tackling corruption. This year, we want to complete the financial sector regulation process that was started more than 5 years ago in response to the financial crisis. We're also working on reforming the International Monetary Fund. We need an IMF that reflects the realities of the changing weight in the global economy. The ongoing resistance by the United States Congress to propose changes to the IMF is disappointing, and we will continue to take opportunities to urge the United States to implement these reforms as a matter of urgency. G20 governments are also committed to making our tax systems stronger. Of course, governments in developed and developing countries rely on taxes to fund the services their communities need. It's clear that international tax laws have failed to keep pace with changes in the global business environment. We need to address the gaps that allow some multinational corporations to artificially reduce their tax bills. G20 countries are working with the OECD to establish standards on tax transparency, and this will allow governments to adopt policies such as ensuring profits are taxed in the location where the economic activity takes place. Now that's simple. Profits are taxed in the location where the economic activity takes place. The G20 is also promoting transparency through greater exchange of information between tax administrators in different countries. Developing and low-income countries will face unique challenges in implementing the tax transparency initiatives. And there's been very close consultation with them as part of this process. These reforms will be most effective if all jurisdictions are involved and benefit from them. The G20 is also playing an effective role in addressing corruption. Corruption costs developing economies around $1 trillion in lost revenue, and that's annually, $1 trillion annually, money that could be used to build infrastructure and deliver services. The G20 is developing principles to improve the transparency of information on who owns and controls companies. Adoption of these principles will help strengthen the investment climate and reduce this lost revenue. Citizens from any country, whether they're from G20 member countries or not, share some fundamental aspirations: a life free of poverty, secure employment, and opportunities for their children for a better future. Achieving sustainable and balanced growth across G20 economies and more broadly is central to giving all people the chance to fulfil their potential. So in summary, the Australian Government is committed to an ambitious G20 agenda aimed at raising the level of the G20's collective GDP by more than 2%. The Australian Government is committed to policies that will facilitate balanced development and growth. And as our Prime Minister has said, the G20 is ultimately about people. It's not about governments. It is in that context that the C20 has an important role in presenting the voices of the world's most vulnerable to the G20 leaders. And listening to your recommendations will help ensure people across the globe benefit from the G20's work. It is a fact that more than half the world's poor population live in G20 countries. So the G20 is working to benefit people in all developing countries through more open trade, less regulation, better infrastructure, improved banking regulation and more efficient tax systems. The G20's development agenda, including its focus on infrastructure, taxation, financial inclusion and remittances, will help the poor and the vulnerable and contribute to global growth. I encourage you to generate practical ideas on these topics over the coming 2 days. I'm encouraged to hear, Tim, that the plan is to have a communique that is under 3 pages, obviously very fine print. It is your ideas and your contributions that will help ensure G20 leaders take into account the perspectives of those most in need. I look forward to hearing your ideas on how that global birthday cake can be divided. We value your contribution. We look forward to receiving your recommendations from the C20 Summit as we prepare for an important G20 meeting in Australia in November. I wish you all the very best.
Thank you very much, Minister. The sector greatly appreciates you being here today and your comments. We're also really looking forward to an ongoing discussion with you about the future of the aid program. It's wonderful to hear your comments about tax transparency, fossil fuel subsidies, and the ambitious growth target. I think it occurred to me that it'd be wonderful to hear more about an inclusive growth target, which is something we'll be discussing here. But once again, thank you very much for being here.